Whether states have the general right to exclude migrants is an issue that has been debated in terms both of freedom and of distributive justice. This paper addresses the issue of migration controls from the point of view of a particular account of freedom, broader than non-interference, namely non-domination. Domination is understood as being subject to the arbitrary power of another in an unequal status relationship, whether or not there is actual interference at any particular point in time. This account of freedom has been articulated mainly at the domestic political level with respect to citizens of a bounded state, where it's understood to require certain kinds of institutional structures that guarantee and publicly recognize the equal status of citizens, provide for the contestability of decisions, and protect citizens from arbitrary or discretionary exercises of power. It's compatible with and requires extensive regulation by law, which, although it may interfere, does not dominate insofar as it is not arbitrary. Migration is an area in which the theory of non-domination may seem to have particular relevance. While the classic cases of domination most frequently cited are slaves and wives within a patriarchal marriage, some of the starkest contemporary examples of vulnerability to arbitrary exercises of power may be seen in the realm of migration and access to citizenship, where states are considered to have rights to exclude, and where discretionary procedures remain particularly widespread in practice. Those who are not fully protected by the legal structures or are not participants in the political structures of a state may be particularly vulnerable to the threat of domination. Non-citizens are vulnerable to domination by individuals and groups in society, insofar as they lack the full range of protections of citizens, and by the state, insofar as they lack the power to contest its decisions politically, and insofar as its powers over them are more discretionary than over citizens. If we take non-domination as an important value to be realized, such domination of non-citizens has significant implications. The relevance of the theory may seem clearly evident in the case of resident non-citizens, but in this paper I address the more complex question of its application to controls on entry and residence. Non-domination, I'll argue, provides a basis for considering migration controls that's different from arguments based on a right to free movement or on the need for coercion to be democratically justified. In recent years, a variety of arguments with respect to freedom has emerged. It's been argued, most notably by Joseph Cairns, that migration controls interfere with the right of freedom of movement. But if freedom of movement cannot be shown to be a right that warrants absolute constraints on others, does it establish a strong case against immigration controls? Even if it's an important interest, it may be limited in certain ways, and so doesn't constitute an absolute right, it may be argued. It may have to be balanced against other interests and rights, self-determination or free association and so forth. And it may not offer us much guidance as to how we should address migration controls in non-ideal conditions, as we were discussing. A different argument with respect to freedom as autonomy, and framed in the context of democratic theory, has been proposed by Arish Abizadeh, who claims that migration controls coerce all outsiders and hence require some kind of democratic justification to all. A right to unilaterally control and close borders, it said, is incompatible with liberal and democratic reasons for the existence of borders except under stringent circumstances, and potential justifications for border restrictions must be addressed in democratic forums in which foreigners, on whom such restrictions coercively fall, also have standing to participate. But do migration controls in fact coerce all foreigners, or rather only threaten to coerce them? And David Miller has argued that only actual interference coerces. Therefore, migration controls actually coerce only some people who try to enter. They only hypothetically coerce others who might try to enter. They rule out only some options because people can go to other countries. And they prevent one specific action, an entry into this country, rather than determine the actions of the other party. So, David Miller's argued, they don't invade autonomy in a way that requires democratic justification for all. Now, I'm not going to weigh in exactly on this debate, though it is what sort of spurred me to think about the relevance of non-domination to the question of border controls. Could we think of border controls as dominating, even if not coercing in the autonomy invading sense? What are the implications? The definition of domination is the power to arbitrarily interfere in the position of another, which I'll define more precisely in a moment. But just draw attention to the moment, it involves, on the one hand, coercion, unchecked coercion, and on the other hand, the threat of such coercion. So domination includes both coercion and the threat of coercion, so it's more expansive than it includes, at least addresses one of the objections of David Miller to Irish Abbassada, but it doesn't include all coercion, because coercion by law, coercion by government, for example, that is constrained by law, does not count as domination. So, to expand briefly on the idea of domination, we take to be being systematically subject to the threat of interference without necessarily being interfered with at a particular point in time. And it's based on having a particular status that makes you vulnerable to that threat of arbitrary power. And those who are, like slaves or the wife in a patriarchal marriage, subject to that power are dependent on the goodwill of the master or the husband. They may experience interference if the master or the husband is angry or whatever. They may not if the master is kind or absent or negligent or whatever. Now, Lovett has redefined more specifically how we might think of as domination. Persons or groups are subject to domination to the extent that they are dependent on a social relationship in which some other person or group wields arbitrary power over them. And this modification allows us to include or avoid situations we might say, well, a person could exercise arbitrary power over somebody, but then that power would be ineffective if the person could leave. So it's only in situations where people cannot leave in the relationship in some sort of way where they're really subject to this power to its full extent. So, domination exists in the context of a relationship of interdependence where those who exercise arbitrary power benefit. Those dominated can't leave the relationship or the exit costs are too high. It exists without actual interference, but in the mere unchecked capacity to interfere. And it leads to, it's not identical with, it leads to often those who are dominated adjusting their behavior to propitiate the dominator, to avoid their wrath and to please them in order to do so. So domination is a wider problem of unfreedom than interference. There are instances of domination in a situation where a person is not actually being interfered with, but some other person or group of persons has the power to interfere arbitrarily in the sense of according only to their will or desire. So, from this point of view, interference, and that's coercion, may be justified when it's not arbitrary. The state interferes with us, law interferes with us, but the difference between law and domination is that law is constrained in all kinds of ways. So coercion can be justified when it's not arbitrary, but domination cannot be justified. It's the threat of arbitrary power over another person. Equally, it may be said that the threat of domination exists in a rather widespread way, so it's not possible to eliminate it. That may be true, but it is possible to reduce or minimize it, and that is, can be taken to be a goal of government. Domination is also not a black and white matter, it's a matter of degree. It varies both in intensity and extent. And Pettit defines intensity in terms of how arbitrary the interference can be, how easy it is for the dominator to interfere, and how severe the measures that can be taken. And the extent of domination can be measured in terms of what areas of a person's life and how many people are affected by the exercise of domination. For Pettit, the priority is identifying where there is domination and trying to intensify non-domination in those areas. And reducing the intensity of domination is prior to increasing the range of choice. So in this context, the range of choice is not really the issue. The issue is really whether the choice the person makes is a matter of their own independent will or subject to the will of the master, dominator, and so forth. Sorry, I'm changing the page there. So, the opposite of domination, non-domination, is freedom in this sense is not a natural property but has to be realised through legal and political structures. And the state has a significant role in realising this freedom. There is, however, a danger that the state itself may be dominating, may gain arbitrary power over its members. So, essential to realising non-domination are legal and political structures that check power and protect it against arbitrary interference. Through the rule of law, the publicly established equal status of citizens, accountable institutions in which power is dispersed, and the contestability of political decisions. So freedom as non-domination is compatible with a considerable degree of state interference as long as this is not arbitrary. Now, domination extends beyond the state, we may argue. It's exercised in particular by states and by non-state actors, corporations, international organisations who have the power to interfere arbitrarily in people's lives. And it can be argued, as people like Bowman and Laborde and Rosoni have, that in current conditions of globalisation, domination is evident in unequal relations between states, the fact that wealthy countries have more power than less developed countries, that weak states are unable to protect their citizens from domination, and they're in a relationship of dependence with developed states. Now, different people draw different conclusions from that. Say Bowman moves in the direction for multi-level global democracy, whereas Laborde and Rosoni argue for the greater defence of states to make the states of the world less dominated by other states, international corporations, etc. Now to move properly to migration. Okay, states claim the right to determine who to admit and who to exclude. Migration is an area in which discretionary powers prevail. So it's not just a general power states claim to determine who to allow to enter, but in practice it's an area in which there are much more discretionary powers, or arbitrary power can be wielded over individuals who appear at borders and so forth. Now, resident non-citizens are subject to domination, lacking equal status, also being subject to more discretionary powers, lacking the power to contest political decisions, being dependent on the host society and the state because their welfare can come to depend on the society in which they come to live and so forth. And however badly they're treated, they either can't exit or there are very high costs to them of exiting. So people like Megan Benton have written really interestingly about the way in which resident non-citizens are subject to domination. But I want to look at what about those outside the state and whether migration controls can be seen as domination. Now I'd argue that if states have a general right to exclude, migration controls are inherently dominating, and the more discretionary they are in operation, the more dominating they are in practice. But there is a real question about how pervasive the dominating effects of migration controls are. How many people, and to what extent, are people's lives affected? Because it's the main point here is that a slave or a wife in Victorian marriage, they live with their master, their husband, and they are subject to their control all the time. Whereas prospective migrants do not live in the States and are not day-to-day subject to the rules, laws, and actions of the states which are excluded. So, however, to warrant addressing domination, it's not necessary to show that everybody is equally dominated by migration controls, only that migration controls create a significant level of domination. Now, we can start by saying that all non-citizens are subject to these controls, except those who live in special travel areas or regional qualities like the EU. We can say that those who are actually rejected for admission or residence are dominated, and those who are threatened with rejection are also dominated, including those living in distant countries who have adapted their expectations about whether they may hope to come to Western countries or wherever, in relation to the difficulty they know of migrating, gaining access to that Western country. So we can say that the domination of outsiders through migration controls extends beyond the actual coercion of people who may appear at the border and be deported or whatever. And we can say that the threat of coercion is not just a remote possibility. But still, we can say outsiders are not subject in the same way as slaves of Victorian wives to the continual threat of interference. Well, let's look at what the intensity and the extent of domination might be for migrants. For Pettit, intensity depends on the degree of arbitrariness, the ease of exclusion, and severity of the measures. And we know that states have, if states claim absolute rights to determine who to admit, the degree of arbitrariness can be quite high, and states do change their admission policies from time to time according to the will of that state, irrespective of the migrant's condition and so forth. The ease of exclusion varies, but states certainly can have a good attempt to exclude migrants, and the severity of measures certainly includes deportation and so forth in ways, and other measures that are pretty significant for human lives. So, the extent of domination. Well, we can say that even if would-be migrants are not continuously subject to interference in each aspect of their lives, as the slave or the wife in the Victorian marriage might be, their whole lives may still be determined by the difficulty of migration and the way that they can live their lives, the kind of career or level of subsistence they have and so forth can be determined by the possibility or the difficulty of migration. We can also say that it affects all those who would have some significant reason to migrate, including those who live in countries where there's no level of secure domination, non-domination, as well as other reasons people might have to migrate. And we might say that the effects of domination are evident in the ways that people living in distant countries often change their behaviour in order to gain admission. So they destroy their identity documents. They marry people they feel no affection for. People make major changes in their behaviour in order to try to meet the criteria that states apply in their migration controls. So I'd argue that the intensity of domination involved in migration controls is sufficient to make it substantial or important, and that it extends to a significant proportion of the world population. So what are the implications of this? Well, in a world of genuinely independent states, even if they were unequal, the scope of domination by migration controls might be limited to those who are coerced or threatened by coercion, perhaps. But under conditions of contemporary globalization, migration controls contribute to the domination entailed in relationships of globalization mentioned earlier. Those asymmetrical power relationships in which those in less developed countries, principally but not only, are dependent on and subject to the arbitrary power of those in less developed states. Migration controls make it impossible or extremely costly to exit from this relationship of dependency. It's true that each regime may control only entry to one state, but the actions of many states jointly exclude migrants from the developed world or whatever, even if those states do not have a joint intention. So for domination to occur, it's not necessary that there be a collective intention of Western states to exclude migrants, but it's the effect of the actions of individual states which constitutes domination of those excluded. Because unlike coercion, domination, I think, does not require an intention, just being in a position to interfere, as the benign master. The benign master dominates, but has no intention of interfering, but is still in a dominating position over the slave, who has to fear the fact that he or she may be sold to another master, or the master may change his temperament or whatever. So migration controls at least make a significant contribution to relations of domination. So, what would the implications of this be? The implications would be that we should reduce domination by lifting or limiting the arbitrariness of migration controls. It's not that migration controls should be lifted completely, but they shouldn't be arbitrary, they should be constrained in some kind of way. Nor is the implication of this that they should be democratically justified to all. So between the human rights argument and the democratic justification argument, I think, is where the non-domination argument fits in. So what reducing domination would entail would be establishing the legal status of migrants which would be equal in respects other than admission. Now, not equal to citizens necessarily, but equal as human beings in having certain kind of moral, legal standing in relation to migration controls. Applying rule of law requirements to migration controls, limiting arbitrary power and limiting the use of discretionary procedures, making accountable the institutions that determine migration law and policies, suggesting a sort of higher regulatory authority, maybe perhaps something like the UNHCR in relation to refugees, applying to migration law. And in addition, making migration law and policy contestable in some way by those who are subjected. This might not be a matter of political participation, democratic participation in determining the laws, but the possibility of contestation, whether that be judicial or political in some sense. Now, just briefly mention an objection that I haven't answered fully here, and other people have written better about, including some people here, but I just mentioned it at any rate. It can be argued that those who take the non-domination perspective, in the Republican tradition, think of non-domination as having two features. Non-domination is realised by a free person who has got these institutional protections in a state, in a free state, a state itself that is not subject to domination by other states or outside agents. And states must not be dominated. It's argued that it's part of self-determination to be able to determine who can enter a state. And that it could be seen that limiting the power to control who enters is dominating the state itself, and therefore undermining the non-domination of citizens within that state. And there are a number of responses I'm just going to mention briefly and not develop. One is that control of membership is not the same as control of territory. Perhaps sovereignty over borders is not an essential part of sovereignty. Control of membership may not be essential to self-government. We can come back to that later if you want. And finally, and most importantly, within this theory, even if a free state is necessary for non-domination, a free state is a state that is not dominated. That is, a state that is not subject to arbitrary interference. But what the theory would propose is not a state subject to arbitrary interference, but a state subject to non-arbitrary regulation that would be constrained itself by international law and so forth. So a state can be subject to regulation without being dominated. Thus, I think this is the sketch of an argument, at least, that non-domination is compatible with non-arbitrary regulation of states' border controls. A further objection that has been put forward is, well, and this ties into something that arose earlier, that surely people have a right to exclude invading forces and colonizing powers. And I think the key feature here is that non-domination is suggesting that those who cannot be excluded are people who are not intrinsically dominating. They are people who don't have a superior status, unlike the colonizing power, and they don't wield arbitrary powers. Those who are entering with a superior status, I think that applies, as I mentioned, to Margaret, to maybe to the Han Chinese who are coming into Tibet and so forth, could be seen as tending to actually dominate through their migration. But migrants who come without the superior status, as most migrants do to Western states, who have no arbitrary powers to wield over the citizens of the country where they are coming, can't themselves be seen as dominating or potentially dominating individuals. So, this sort of sketch of an argument of where a theory of domination and non-domination might get you in relation to border controls has tried to argue that the domination exercised through migration controls is of intensity and extent to warrant limiting the power of states to grant or refuse admission arbitrarily. It doesn't mean that no restrictions in migration are justified. It just means limiting the arbitrary power of states to exclude. Migration controls would be less dominating if you could grant some kind of equal status to would-be migrants, establish a system of non-arbitrary law, and limit the discretionary procedures and allow contestation of decisions. This non-domination approach offers a critique of migration controls based on freedom that doesn't depend on an absolute right of freedom of movement, nor need to assume that all are equally coerced by migration controls. But the conclusion is that if border controls infringe freedom, the political response needs to be in terms of freedom rather than in terms of distributive justice. There may be distributive justice issues as well, but it is a freedom issue here that needs to be addressed by a response in the zone of freedom. And the aim then of this approach would be to reduce the most intense domination, even if domination cannot be